To make a long story short, use the pros. Don't just jump into stuff because you think you know better, because it's possible that you don't. And unless you have developed a deep, deep well of experience to pull from, and you've done a certain type of deal in an area a bunch of different times, you should be relying on the expertise of others to help you avoid making those mistakes.
Welcome to the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. I'm your host, Axel Ragnarsson, and on this show, I dissect how seasoned multifamily investors started, built, and scaled their businesses.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another quick solo episode here on the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to discuss why it is so important for new investors to protect themselves and how new investors can avoid becoming their own worst enemy or avoid tripping themselves up. And sounds like a bit of an abstract, vague intro, and it is in some way, but I'm going to talk about an experience I had when I was doing the first deal I ever did in real estate. And I'm also going to use a bunch of different examples here to illustrate what I'm talking about throughout. But the overarching thesis here, or topic that I'm trying to communicate, is that oftentimes early in their careers, new investors don't realize that they can set up checks and balances around their business to protect themselves from making costly mistakes. And oftentimes folks don't do this, and they make mistakes they otherwise don't need to make. And oftentimes they make these mistakes because they're too afraid to involve others in their business or to hire competent professionals. So let me tell a quick story, and then I'm going to get into some specific action items that a new investor can take to avoid tripping over their own feet, so to speak, and how they can protect themselves. But rewind back to 2016, which was the year I did my first deal. It was a 3-unit multifamily property in my hometown in southern New Hampshire. And I bought this deal with private money financing. And as a result, there was no checks and balances around the underwriting process, right? When you work with a private lender, there isn't necessarily going to be an appraisal process. There isn't necessarily going to be competent underwriting done by the lender, because it might just be an individual, or it might just be, if it's a hard money lender, they're in the business of lending money on questionable projects, so they're not doing a lot of this diligence. And that's great, right? It allows you to get into maybe some hairier projects or to streamline that process as a borrower, as a buyer. But there's also a flip side to that coin, right? When you're working with a more traditional lender, whether it's an agency lender or a local bank, a local credit union, some other kind of quote unquote traditional lender, they're going to have different checks and balances in place. They're going to have an appraisal done. If it's a larger project, they might want a phase 1 environmental report done. They're going to be doing some underwriting on their side of the house, right? From a cash flow standpoint, from a debt service coverage standpoint. And not only are your eyes on the deal, but you have another set of eyes on the deal. So to bring this back to the story that I was telling, I didn't have those things, right? Got a home inspection done. Everything looked good. And then I went and closed on the property. Now, a year later, when I went to sell that property, I realized that the property wasn't necessarily financeable, right? And I was trying to sell it to an owner occupant, somebody that would come in with an FHA loan and buy it. And what I realized was that there was like all kinds of different structural components that wouldn't necessarily allow the property to qualify for an FHA loan or even a conventional loan. And two of the big ones were that it was on private utilities, and the septic tank was too small to service all 3 units. I mean, it was big enough to service the 3 units. It wasn't like there was any problems in the actual mechanical use of the septic tank, but it didn't meet the underwriting requirements or the check boxes of a traditional lender, and specifically of an FHA loan, or it wouldn't pass FHA appraisals, is what I'm trying to say. And it also had a dug well instead of a drilled well, which increases the likelihood that there could be some water contamination. And again, we didn't have issues with the water, but that disqualified it from a lot of conventional financing. So when I sold that property, I had to go find a buyer who was a cash buyer, or somebody who was also going to be coming in with private financing. And it significantly impacted the price I was able to achieve. I didn't know any of this when I bought it, right? Because I wasn't forced to go through that process. I didn't have those checks and balances in place. So that's one example. I couldn't protect myself from myself because I didn't know any better. And if I had worked with a traditional lender, I may have gotten around that, right? Or just missed on that deal, or passed on that deal as a result. And everything turned out fine, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But I could have made a lot more if the property was financeable. And that was something I found out as I was listing it. It was unbeknownst to me. Some other examples of this, and I'm just going to start with the biggest one and then I'll sprinkle some other ones in. Some other examples of this, and again, as I mentioned, the big one is construction management. If you are a new investor and you do not come from a construction background and you are not familiar with the cost to renovate certain things, renovate apartments or put a roof on a property or replace the windows, and you don't come from a construction management background and you don't have experience managing subs and GCs, you need to do everything you possibly can to remove yourself from that process because you will get hosed. The unfortunate reality is that if you are a newer investor, you're a mark, you're a target. And most GCs, I'm not going to broadly categorize all, right? But I'm going to say most GCs, a lot of GCs or subs, look at someone that they don't see as experienced, and they're going to push their pricing, and they're going to see where they can, get away with some things around the edges. Oh, you're not going to sign a contract with us when we start the job? Okay, we're just going to take a lot longer to deliver a finished product. This, that, the other, right? And this is especially true for younger people. If you're in your early 20s, mid 20s, and you look younger, this only adds to this whole part of the process. I can't even begin to even imagine how much more money I spent on construction because I was just inexperienced and I didn't understand that process, and I was probably being taken advantage of for the first few years I was in the business. And if I were to go back and do it all over again, I just wouldn't have been involved in that process. I would have just worked with a property management company that had a construction management offering, right? As a part of their property management services, their PM services. When a unit goes vacant and we're going to go spend 15 grand, the PM company manages that process. And I would have gladly paid the construction management fee to do that. And I would have saved an inordinate amount of money by removing myself from that process. I was my own worst enemy in that standpoint. And just a huge mistake looking back. And I see so many new investors, again, and I talk about this all the time on the podcast. They step over dollars to save pennies. They step over dollars because they don't think they should be paying other people or they don't think they can afford it. What you can't afford is being taken for a ride because you don't know better. So if you're somebody that doesn't have significant construction management experience, you don't have an extensive vendor list, you don't have a great sense of what it costs to renovate units or to do other key CapEx, then remove yourself from that. You can't be involved in that part of the process because you're going to screw it up. So work with a PM who, maybe they charge 8-10% of a job cost. If it's a $20,000 unit turn, if they charge you 10%, that's a couple grand, but it's probably going to get done faster. It's probably going to get done or it's going to be taken out to folks that these individuals have worked with numerous times, and that therefore reduces the likelihood that you're going to get screwed by the contractor that you hire. They probably have competitive pricing, and they're probably going to pay for that already incremental fee just by securing a better price for you as their client. And you're reducing the likelihood that you just get screwed over. One of the biggest tips I can ever provide a new investor: get out of your own way from a construction standpoint. And there's all kinds of other different examples of this, and I'll just sprinkle through. Use an attorney to review your loan docs, to create your operating agreements. Use a broker when you're selling. Again, I sold some properties directly to buyers because they reached out. I had a price I thought was compelling. We agreed on a price. I thought I knew the market well enough to understand what I needed, wanted to save a couple bucks on the brokerage fee side. And then I sell, and then I look back a couple months later and I'm like, wow, I think I might have left some money on the table, and maybe I actually undermarketed or undersold from a pricing standpoint. And now it's just kind of like a hard line in the sand. I just simply will not sell properties directly to buyers. I just hire brokers. That's just what it is. It's a hard line in the sand. I need to protect myself from myself in the sense that I miss a piece of the equation along the way. Use professionals during due diligence. Use the home inspectors. Bring in people that can cover your butt. And again, I think a fundamental takeaway from this episode, if you're a new investor, is sure, it is expensive to hire professionals. Sure, maybe you want to save a couple bucks by doing this yourself or doing that yourself. But the more eyeballs you have on different parts of the process, from an investing standpoint, from the acquisition standpoint, the management standpoint, construction standpoint, the sales standpoint, all of that, right? The more likely it is that you don't put yourself in a position where you're just running into a wall because you don't know any better. So to make a long story short, use the pros. Don't just jump into stuff because you think you know better, because it's possible that you don't. And unless you have developed a deep well of experience to pull from, and you've done a certain type of deal in an area a bunch of different times, you should be relying on the expertise of others to help you avoid making those mistakes. If you found this episode helpful, please consider leaving the show a rating and a review, as it helps the podcast get noticed by more folks. And as always, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode.